The reading today is Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me, and what answer am I to give this complaint. And the Lord's answer is, Then the Lord replied, Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets, so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness.
Morning, Miranda. Thanks for having me. My name's Tim Anderson. I'm one of the volunteer pastors with Soul Revival. I've preached here before. Thank you for the invite back. It's always nice to know you're welcome. Always welcome here. Always see lots of smiles. Had a lovely breakfast. Don't even get hot breakfast at home. So having it here was really delicious. For those who cooked it, thank you. And today I wanted to give you a bit of an introduction in this sermon to Habakkuk. Because the rest of our talented preaching team are going to be concentrating on more of the details. So my goal here is to set the context, give you an idea about what's happening around it, tell what's happening before in times of what's happening with Judah and Israel, and also to give you the political environment or the geopolitical environment of 605 AD, which I'm sure you're all fascinated about. But this will include the roles of some of those mighty empires of that time. The Assyrians, Babylonians, and the Egyptians, they all intersect in this period of time, and they all have an impact on Israel and God's people at that time. Some of you may know the word Syria. You've heard of the country of Syria, but there was a country of Assyria, and there actually are Assyrians and Assyrian Christians that are still around. Assyria is more in the area of what we would know as modern-day Iraq. There is the town of Mosul would have been one of the central parts of the empire. That sat across from the capital of the Assyrian Empire at the time, one which was destroyed, and it was so utterly destroyed that in the 1800s, German archaeologists were walking across that part of Iraq trying to see if they could find the capital, Nineveh. If may bring you some memories, of course, that's where Jonah went to speak to. Couldn't find it, so they said that it was all rubbish. There wasn't an Assyrian Empire. But only about 60 years later, they actually discovered it and they excavated it. And it was sitting on the other side of the Tigris, and it is a real city. And so this is real historical fact. It's not an invention. It's actually based on archaeological fact. So these empires existed, and they did do the things they said, and the history of this is recorded throughout the Bible, but also in other tablets and non-biblical sources. So this is real history. So my goal is to give you a bit of a picture of the world that Habakkuk saw and wrote about and wrote in. And I was also hoping you might get a glimpse of the sovereignty of God, even in the turbulent times of this book. Like many of you, I just want to, as you think, I'm looking around you, so I'm assuming, I'm making an assumption, but I don't think I'm too wrong about that. A lot of you grew up in the Sutherland Shire, yeah? Would that be fair? A number of you did? Well, I grew up in, whilst I was born in Brisbane, my parents actually moved to Caringbah. And so I grew up around Caringbah, but I had a lot of my friends around Cronulla, so I grew up in that part of the Shire. And like many teenagers, and teenagers don't feel funny about this, but it's true. As a teenager, we're all a little bit at sea. We really don't know who we are. We're trying to find out who we are. We're trying to understand how the world works, where we fit in it, our bit. So I didn't really know who I was when I was, when 13, 14, 15, and why painful things happened around me. My parents actually ended up getting separated and eventually divorced. My mother did eventually remarry. So I was at a church every week, but with all this thing happening in my personal life, I was often struggling to believe that God would really act. I said prayers, but life did not feel full of answered prayers sometimes. Felt like I'd shout to the heavens and I wouldn't get a response. It felt really hard and a bit confusing, and sometimes, like, honestly, a bit lonely. I knew God existed, but I did want to follow him, but I often felt let down and unsure of his nearness to me. Looking back now, I can see that some of that is what happens when you're a teenager. You don't realise it when you don't realise it until later, that's part of that phase that you have in life. Some of it was real pain, though. It wasn't something that was not. But much of it was a struggle to trust God when life didn't make sense to me. And I suspect that this experience is closer to our own for all of us than we might want to admit. We sit in church, sing the words, say the prayers, and still quietly wondering whether God is really hearing us. We can keep doing the right thing outwardly while inwardly sometimes feeling disappointed, sometimes confused, and sometimes we get tired of waiting for that prayer to get answered. That is one reason why Habakkuk matters so much. The prophet talks about the kind of faith that's not neat, it's not clean, but it is real and it is honest and struggling, but still reaching for God. But Habakkuk is dealing with something far greater than my teenage confusion at the time. He is living through a time of real moral collapse, political instability, and coming judgment. He's looking at his nation and he's asking the question, many believers have probably asked in absolutely every generation, and that is, how long, Lord? How long? How long is this going to go on for? Most prophetic books speak from God to his people. And you'll read that in whether it's Jeremiah or even Jonah to a certain extent. But Habakkuk speaks from him and his people to God. It's the other way round. And it begins not with a polished speech, but with a cry. And if you've read the book already, it doesn't take very long. You can probably do it in about 20 minutes. You'll hear this in Habakkuk 1:2. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? So this is so human. It's such a human question, isn't it? And it's something, that's why I love the Bible, because it's so human. You can see us, if we're in that situation, saying these things. It's not like holier than thou, it's pretty earthy. How long do I keep praying for change in my family? How long do I watch injustice and feel powerless to stop it? How long do I wait for God to act when everything in front of me seems to be getting worse and not better? So it's not a tidy book. It's not polished. It's not a comfortable book. It's a book for people who look at the world or look at their own lives and say, Lord, I don't understand what you're doing. So it's very honest. And this is why this book matters. Before we walk through the chapters in detail over the coming weeks with other talented preachers, we need to feel the weight of the world that Habakkuk is speaking into. So my task today is to set that stage, to help you see why he's crying out, what has gone wrong in Judah, and how God meets his people when suffering and confusion and judgment seem to close in all at once. So why are we in the story? So let's go back a little bit in time, just before Habakkuk was writing, because we need to understand this concept and the kingdom of David. So before we understand Habakkuk's complaint, we need to step back a little bit and remember what Judah sits in the larger story of God's people. After Solomon, the kingdom split into two kingdoms, and they, instead of just being Israel, you had the northern kingdom, which is Israel, became known as Israel, and the southern kingdom, known as Judah. So the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, their territory was ruled by a separate king, not of the line of David. And the southern kingdom, which was Benjamin, Judah, and mostly the Levites, was their territory was known as Judah, and it was ruled by a descendant of David, so David, Solomon. So northern kingdom, not God's line; southern kingdom, God's line, which becomes important when we get into genealogy back in Matthew. So don't worry about that for the future. You can read that yourself, but you'll see the unbroken line of Jesus comes down through the kings of Judah. It comes down. So both kingdoms had kings. Both kingdoms had prophets speaking to them, and I won't go into those, but you can find them yourself. God was trying to correct them through the use of prophets. Both kingdoms had warnings, but the story of each kingdom unfolds slightly differently, actually quite differently when it comes to it in terms of the length of the kingdoms. Israel did not last as long as Judah did, but Judah did go the way, sadly, of what happened to Israel. Israel had 19 kings, and not one of them truly led the nation back to faithfulness. They're all bad. So from a not maybe from the citizens' perspective, because during some of those kings, Judah expanded its territory and became quite prosperous. But from their faithfulness to God and to the temple, they were not wholehearted supporters of the living God. Again and again, the people gave themselves into idolatry, injustice, immorality, and violence. Prophets like Amos and Hosea pleaded with them, but they didn't. They did not repent. The Israelite kingdom didn't repent. So in 722 BC, so a long time ago, we mentioned them just previously, God allowed Assyria, which was the superpower of the day, to sweep in and destroy the northern kingdom. That should have been a warning to the southern kingdom about what could happen to them. It should have made them stop and listen. But they didn't. Judah's story is, I don't know if I want to use the word thankful, but it is actually a bit more mixed. There are actually bright moments in Judah, but there is also deep darkness. Some kings feared the Lord. Others led the nation into terrible sin. And this is some of the things that Habakkuk has these complaints about. Firstly, Hezekiah. So Hezekiah was a faithful king of the southern kingdom. In fact, when I was in Jerusalem, I saw Hezekiah's wall. He built the wall that actually stopped the Assyrians. And you can read about this in the Old Testament. That wall was part of that process that stopped the Assyrians taking over Judah at that time. So Hezekiah was faithful. Manasseh, not so good. Deeply, deeply wicked. And we'll read a little bit about why the Bible thinks that about him. Amon, wicked. Josiah, faithful. In fact, Josiah, we've got kids at Saturday night named Josiah because Josiah was one of the good kings. After this, Josiah, so we went up, then we went down, then we went down, then we went up, and then we just keep going down. We get the next kings. Jehoash, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and the last Zedekiah. All bad, all wicked. So the long history now brings us to where we are in Habakkuk's own moment. So he probably writes during the reign of Jehoiakim, who's the third last king of Judah, and he's one of Judah's corrupt kings. Judah was meant to be the faithful remnant because they were David's line. But by this point, they just looked more and more like the nations that are about them. They looked like everybody else, which is a warning for us all, really. And this is the issue. God's chosen holy people, no longer holy and no longer different from anyone else. This decay didn't happen overnight. This wasn't a decay that just suddenly occurred like that. It was a spiritual decline that happened in a slow process. It just happened one decision after another. Just like sometimes it happens in our lives. Just one bad decision, then another, then another, then another, and down they went, down the slide. And people some of them kept the outward appearance of faith, but in their hearts, they were drifting further and further away from God. God's people had ignored his word for generations. In fact, if you read, they lost the scriptures. They didn't even know the scriptures were there. They didn't know what was in them. They actually rediscovered them, and they were brokenhearted about that. And the consequence of this, when you can't just reject God, and I think this is something for all of us to remember, you can't just reject God and expect his favour. You just can't do that. You can't do that with a human being either. You can't reject a person and then expect their favour. God is relational. He wants a relationship with you. And if you're rejecting him, you can't just say, I don't want to know anything about you, but give me all the good bits. It just doesn't work like that. So Habakkuk is not crying out into like a vacuum, into an empty space. He's crying out in the middle of a nation that was wandering or had wandered a long way from where they were supposed to be. From the start, under Moses and Joshua, they looked nothing like the Israelites of that time. So the world around Judah, there had empires rising and falling, but Judah's crisis is not only internal. Habakkuk is also standing in the middle of a rapidly changing world, sort of like us, really. Nations are shifting, empires are rising, powers are falling, powers are rising, and at the same, and to make sense of the moment and to help picture the geography around the time, I just want to throw a map up. Hopefully you can see the map. This will give you a bit of a picture, and one reason why poor old Israel was always getting smashed. And whether it was we talk about it, whether it's whether the Jews were getting smashed, and we could go back in time. Were they getting? First we have the Assyrians. The Assyrians wanted to. Israel sits in this little space on the Mediterranean coast. So it's where empires march upwards and downwards. So you've got Egypt down to the south, which is the mighty Egypt, the Egypt of the great pyramids. Cleopatra comes later, but of the great kings, Ramses II, those people you've probably heard of. And to get to Egypt from the great empires, which are where it says Meshach, that is the world of Assyria. Then Meshach is like the Greek world. Assyria is in where you've got Nineveh on the Tigris. You've got Babylonia to the right. So those empires can't go through the Arabian desert. So there's this big centre of the Arabian Peninsula that empires can't march through because they'll all die. So the only area that they can get down to Egypt, or Egypt to get back up, is through Israel. So it's like a passageway for empires. And in the future, we'll hear about the Greeks will march through them, the Romans will march through them, the Persians will march through them. So poor old Israel and Judah are like a passageway for world empires moving backwards and forwards between Africa and Asia. So you can see where they're positioned in relation to Assyria, Babylonia, and Egypt. And it's a strategic corridor. As I mentioned, armies move through and through it. It's also a trading corridor. The trade goes up and down between Africa and Asia through there. And of course, as I've just mentioned before, empires fight over it because they want to control it. They want to control the means of access. So Judah's not tucked away from the pressures of the world. It's right in the middle of them. And that goes for Israel too. Okay, so at this time, when we're talking about Habakkuk's day, Assyria is collapsing. It was a great and powerful empire. I had some great king names. I'll come to some of them in a minute, but a couple that come to me are Tiglath-Pileser, Shalmaneser II. They're great names. You can look them up in Kings. You'll read all about them. Egypt is competing, so Egypt is rising again. Babylonia is part of the Assyrian Empire, but it's about to take a different position. Before it was subservient to the Assyrians, it's now going to grow to power. And Judah, under Jehoiakim, is sliding towards judgment. So by Habakkuk's day, Assyria, once feared for its cruelty and military power, is fading. And I could go into it, but I would love to do something on Jonah because I love Jonah. I'll tell you all about the Assyrians then, so invite me back for that. That's one of my favourite books. The empire that destroyed the northern kingdom in 722 BC is now itself in this decline. So Nineveh falls in 612, and Assyria's last resistance collapsed soon after. So that's just the Babylonians. So the Babylonians, who were basically a vassal state, has now risen and actually taken over the Assyrian Empire. At the same time, Egypt is trying to regain its influence. It had dropped off in influence for the couple of hundred years before, but it had started to rise back to power. And Pharaoh Necho II moves north to fill the vacuum from Assyria's decline. So Judah feels that pressure directly. After the death of Josiah in 609, Egypt removes Jehoahaz and places Jehoiakim on Judah's throne as a vassal. So Egypt effectively is running Judah at this stage. Judah is not only spiritually compromised, it's politically controlled as well. It's becoming a vassal state. That is a state that is subservient to a greater state that sits over the top of it. And then there's Babylon. Under Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar, well, you probably don't know Nabopolassar, but this guy you should know, Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylonian rises with astonishing speed. First, they defeat the Assyrians, and then in 605, they beat the Egyptians at Carchemish, a giant battle, which is Carchemish battle occurred just about where Megiddo is, the plains of Megiddo in Israel. From that point on, Babylon becomes the dominant power of the region. And this is what makes Habakkuk so confronting. God says, I am rising up the Babylonians. This is in Habakkuk 1-6. Babylon's rise is not outside of God's control. It's part of his sovereign purpose. The Lord who sees Judah's sins is also directing the movement of nations. So the world around Judah is unstable, threatening, and full of fear, and it's into that world that God speaks, into all this time. And we live in a world a little bit like that. We have, after World War II, we had a world order. All the things were set in place and things were working pretty well. But things are now changing. Powers are moving. We're moving into a world that's becoming a bit more unstable. Sort of like Habakkuk's time in one sense. Not as bad, but it is changing. So we need to think about that as well. So written over 2,500 years ago, but some of these themes are things that we should think about because they're just as relevant today as they were back then. So the wider political turmoil matters because it is the context in which God is about to act. And the reason he must act is not simply that the nations are unstable, because nations have always been unstable, but that Judah itself stands guilty before God. His character is both loving and just. We know this when we hear about God, how he is slow to anger and abounding in love. But he is just. He is just. He loves his people, but he will not ignore unrepented sin forever. His patience will not last forever. His patience is real, but as I said, it's not endless. For generations, he has warned Judah, called them back through the prophets, and held back judgment. But now the nation stands under the weight of its own rebellion. And if we want to understand why Habakkuk's prayer is so urgent, we need to see the kinds of sins that were rife in Judah at the time. We need that context that was amongst the kings and the people. So let's have a look at 2 Kings. And this is written about Manasseh, who is not the king you actually want to have. King Manasseh. 2 Kings, if you want to look it up, 2 Kings 21, 3-6. Manasseh. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He also erected altars to Baal and made Asherah poles, as Ahab, king of Israel, had done. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem, I will put my name. In the courts of the temples, he built altars to all the starry hosts. He sacrificed his own son, human sacrifice, infant sacrifice in the fire. He practiced divination. He sought omens, consulted mediums and spiritualists, and he did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his fierce anger. There was also widespread injustice. So I don't know if you know anything about how God works, but none of that's good. In case anybody's confused, that's absolutely everything that God said not to do. But there was also widespread injustice, 2 Kings 21-16. Moreover, Manasseh also shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end, beside the sin that he had caused Judah to commit, so that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And he refuses to repent from 2 Kings 23, 26-27. Nevertheless, the Lord did not turn away from the heat of his fierce anger, which burned against Judah because of all that Manasseh had done to arouse his anger. So the Lord said, I will remove Judah also from my presence, and I will remove Israel, and I will reject Jerusalem, the city I chose to put this temple on, about which I said, my name shall be there. All of that is why Habakkuk's opening cry in chapter 1 is not an exaggeration. It is the language of a man watching covenant life collapse before his eyes. And it sums it up like this. Habakkuk catches it in this one line, Habakkuk 1:4. The law is paralysed, justice never prevail, and the wicked hem in the righteous. This is not a monumental lapse. This is not a bad week for Judah. This is the fruit of generations of spiritual decline. This is the Judah Habakkuk sees, and this sits behind the book. This is the context behind the book, why he's wanting to write and to cry out to God. This is the burden that he carries so heavily. And once we see that clearly, we are ready to understand the deeper questions that drives the rest of the book. Habakkuk is not confused about Judah's sins. He knows. He knows judgment is deserved. And frighteningly, he knows it's overdue. His struggle goes deeper than that. Lord, how can you use Babylon, a nation more wicked, to judge us? God's chosen people, people that he pulled out of Egypt. The people of Moses, the people of Aaron, the people of David, the people of Solomon. How can you use the Babylonians, pagan worshipping, godless savages, to judge us? How can you do that? And this is the heart of the book. This is the struggle. This is the tension. This is the tension. Habakkuk can understand that Judah deserves judgment. He knows that. He knows that they deserve judgment. What he can't understand is why God would use a nation even more brutal and arrogant and violent to carry it out. And often, that is where faith is most tested for us as well. We may accept that God is at work, but we struggle with the way he chooses to work. God is not AI. We can't just ask him for something and expect to get an answer. He'll answer in how he chooses to, because he's sovereign. Not merely that he does, but how he chooses to do it. We ask questions like, why this path? Why do you use this to? Why this result? Habakkuk is not wrestling with a small problem. And these are problems we wrestle with, I think. I know I do. He is trying to understand our God more deeply. He's trying to understand why. Habakkuk is wrestling with the questions so many believers have wrestled with over time. If you haven't, I would be surprised. Questions like God's justice. How is that? How does God bring justice? God's timing. Why does he do it not when I want it? Why does God choose that method when I don't like it? Why does God seem silent? He's not. But why does he seem silent to us? And how do we understand God's sovereignty over everything? How do we understand God's sovereignty over everything? Because we sit under God's sovereignty. Things happen to us in ways and means and at times we just don't understand. But we sit under God's sovereignty. So one of the most beautiful things about this book is God does not push away honest questions. He meets people in them. Habakkuk is not unique in this. The Bible gives us the language to faithfully lament, such as in Psalm 13 where David cries out, "How long, O Lord?" Same thing. God doesn't punish you for asking. If you look at it, God is open. He wants to hear you. He's patient. If you remember Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're going, if there's just one, if there's 50 people, don't destroy them. If there's 10, so God goes through all these questions, and he said, yes, if I can find a small remnant, yes, I won't destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. God doesn't reject our questions or doesn't reject us asking. He welcomes them, but he's still going to do his work the way that he chooses to do, because he knows better than you and he knows better than me how he wants to bring out his sovereign will in this world. New Testament is not stranger to this either. Even Paul learns that God's grace can be sufficient when relief does not come in the way he had hoped. Habakkuk belongs to that same long conversation of faith under pressure. And it is where the book becomes so precious. Habakkuk does not stay in the dark with his questions. God answers. Not always the way Habakkuk wants them or expects them, and not every detail he might want, but a word strong enough to steady him. God answers judgment, justice and hope. In 1:5, Habakkuk 1:5, I am doing something you would not believe. God is not inactive. He is not indifferent. He is not absent. And he's not late. Like the Queen was never late. Everybody else was early. So he's working in the way Habakkuk cannot yet see. Then we get to the centre of the book, the verse that actually is while you are all here. If this verse hadn't been read at the time it had been read by the person who had read it, Miranda wouldn't exist. And that verse is Habakkuk 2:4. And the righteous, and it's the second part of it, the righteous will live by faith. So this is the centre of the book, and in many ways one of the great lines that the New Testament draws on in its purpose. The righteous will live by faith. And why you're here is because it's the verse that Martin Luther struggled with. It woke him up. This small little verse from this weird little book in the Old Testament. And he pondered this question: the righteous will live by faith. And it still speaks with such power today. This is not blind faith. It's a faith in the God who holds things in his hands, the God who loved us enough to send his Son for us. God is always good. God is always faithful. But it's our sin that separates. But his grace restores. When the world collapses, when suffering comes, when God's ways leave us confused, well, what then? The answer is faith is the way forward. Not explanation, not control, not certainty, not sight. And faith is not pretending that pain is not real. It is choosing again and again to trust the character of the God who we worship. It is resting in him, knowing who he is, even when his ways are hidden from us. And of course, this is not where the story ends. The faith of Habakkuk is the same faith that we find in the fulfillment of Christ. If Habakkuk teaches us how to wait for God in the dark, the New Testament shows us that God himself stepped into the darkness for us. Jesus entered the world, and he knows what it's like to live under corrupt leaders, violent empires, religious hypocrisy. He's not distant from the world that was like Habakkuk's, and he's not distant from the world that's like ours. Habakkuk says, what do the righteous suffer? At the cross, we see the ultimate answer. The truly righteous one suffered not for his own sin, but for ours. The early church lived out Habakkuk 2:4. The righteous will live by faith. They faced persecution, loss and sanity, and yet they clung to faith. Habakkuk ends with a prayer that sounds like something from the New Testament. Though the fig tree may not bud, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. So this is faith. Not faith in circumstances, not faith in outcomes, but faith in God. So Habakkuk is not just an ancient prophetic speaking into someone else's crisis. His words lead us ultimately to the same place all Scripture leads us to. Trust the God who sees us, who speaks, who lives, who remains faithful. Yet, when we can't see what he's doing, we still trust. One of the greatest gifts of Habakkuk is this. God can handle your questions. He can handle your confusion, your disappointment, your long sessions of waiting. Faith is not pretending everything is fine. It is not switching your brain off. Faith is holding on to God when clarity is gone. Habakkuk is not a book for people who have everything sorted. It's a book for people who are waiting, wrestling, wondering, and still God comes. In other words, it is a book for people like us. And as we walk through it together, chapter by chapter, my prayer is that you will discover that what Habakkuk discovered. He does not move from confusion to full explanation of everything God is doing. He moves from confusion to trust. He moves from protest to praise. He moves from hard questions to steady faith. And often that is what God gives his people still. Not a full explanation, but himself. Not an answer to every mystery, but a reason to keep trusting. That is where this book is leading us. When everything shakes, God remains. When everything confuses, God is wise. When everything hurts, God is always near. And when faith feels weak, God is still faithful. And that is why the righteous will live by faith, and Jesus still changes everything.